a description at the end of what you see going on here. And many of you will recognize this from before. Okay, that is a classic experiment from the 1940s by Heider and Simmel, just demonstrating the point that very elementary stimuli can evoke rich interpretations. In this case, pretty much everybody watching this will come up with some narrative about agents interacting with one another. Every once in a while, somebody will see this and just write down a physical description of triangles moving around, somebody somewhere on the autism spectrum or something. But most of us look at this and we interpret this in terms of agents moving around. So I'm going to be getting back to the possibility that there might be similarly simple stimuli that would get us thinking kinship. But that's what I'm heading for here. I'll be talking about some experiments. We're just in the testing phase, and we're going to start running pretty soon. So that's what I'm leading up to. It's going to take me a little while, though, getting there. So I'm going to be talking about, let me change the view here. Oops. So I'm going to be talking about kinship. And some people here may have some background in cultural anthropology, others not. One could argue that the study of kinship is perhaps the single greatest contribution of anthropology, of cultural anthropology, to the human sciences. So it's, for a long time, had a very central role in anthropology, but not necessarily appreciated widely outside anthropology and psychology and so on, just what it is that anthropologists have discovered in this area. So I'm going to be trying to tie together some of this classic cultural social anthropology of kinship, tying it together with some cognitive psychology. This is going to be a talk about cognition, about thinking. Kinship is also a topic relating to social practice. There's a great deal in the way of institutions and behavior and so on relating to kinship, which is important, interesting stuff, but it's not going to be the topic here. The topic here is mainly going to be kinship cognition. There are a variety of traditions for thinking about kinship. And I'm going to be making a case particularly for the idea that there might be a system of what we could call core cognition, which is related to kinship. I'm going to be making that case, and if the phrase core cognition is a little mysterious at this point, it will, I hope, become clearer later on. I spell out what I mean. Before I do that, let me talk a little bit about some alternative approaches to thinking about kinship. Sort of tell what they have to offer, and then move on to talk more about sort of the approach I'll be taking here toward kinship. So one approach to thinking about kinship comes out of cultural anthropology, particularly out of symbolic anthropology, and that's asking the natives what their theories are about kinship and how people get to be related to or connected with one another. And people following in this tradition, sort of asking the natives, where do babies come from, how are human beings constituted, and so on. People in this tradition find a very wide range of variation across cultures in stories people tell about where babies come from. So, for example, there are societies in which it is reported, at least, that the natives believe that more than one man can contribute to the parenthood of a child. Here's just a diagram. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but this is just for lowland South America in orange over here on the right. A great many societies in which people report that more than one man can contribute to the parentage of a child. These Arawakans have something closer to our belief, but most of lowland South America, that belief is there. Over on the right, this tends to be associated not only with cultural history, but also with social institutions. Whether you emphasize descent through the female line is also something going over there. Won't spend a lot of time on this, just this is the kind of thing that people in this cultural, symbolic tradition do. There's also, a lot of this seems to come up in the sort of Austronesian speaking area. David Schneider sort of being famous or perhaps infamous for claiming that people on the Micronesian island of Yap simply, it's not correct to translate their words, the words that they have, as father or mother, because they don't mean what father and mother mean for us. A mother is more like just the person who takes care of you and you become one with her because of that. It doesn't necessarily imply what mother means for us. A father, again, is somebody from whom you inherit. You have a particular economic connection, but it doesn't mean, father doesn't mean what it does for us. You have Janet Karsten working in Malaysia saying that you become kin by sharing a hearth, by sharing food, and so on, rather than through a genealogical connection. In Madagascar, working among the Viso, you've got Rita Astudi. I've got the references up here. Rita Astudi. Once again, there's a belief that you become a member of a particular group, you become kin to people over the course of time. So you have, for example, people, the Viso, telling Astudi, this kid, you know, he's so light-skinned, it's because he spends all this time hanging out with the missionaries, and that's sort of made his skin lighter. This may all seem fairly exotic. We could actually, though, turn to Charles Darwin, who really should have sat down and read some Gregor Mendel. He didn't do that. But Darwin instead tried to understand, come up with his own theories of heredity. Darwin, in fact, believed first that, well, your inherited constitution can change over the course of your lifetime, rather like these Austronesian groups we've talked about. So he believed in the inheritance of acquired traits. He thought the evidence for that was pretty strong. He also believed, going back to partible paternity, he had stories about how, well, you've got a mare who is mounted by a quagga, which is a stripy beast, and then much later she has the offspring by another sire, but it inherits some of these stripes from the previous individual. There's a whole literature on this. It was called telegony. People really believed you could inherit traits. Darwin thought, he wasn't sure about it, but he thought took seriously that you could inherit traits from more than one male. So you have Darwin believing in it's a very well-informed individual believing in some of this stuff as well. That said, first, there are some serious questions about some of the ethnography in these cases. There have been some pretty strong critical responses to people familiar with Yap, to some of David Schneider's work. You can read, for example, Warren Shapiro has been very effective in criticizing some of these beliefs, has been very critical of looking at other ethnographies of Malaysia, has been very critical of Janet Karsten's work. And you've got Rita Astudi, actually, who's doing something on a more positive note. She's actually teaming up with some cognitive psychologists, including Susan Carey, actually doing some experiments among the Viso where she's asking a bunch of questions. So she's got them telling you that, you become the child of whoever takes care of you. But then she's asking questions about people who are switched with birth. And will the child who's switched at birth grow up to be more like adoptive parents, more like birth parents? And what a study finds is that the actual answers that the VISO give to questions like these are fairly close to those that you get from American adults and contradict this sort of ideology. She suggests it's more an ideology than a deep-rooted belief that you become your adoptive parent's child. So, in other words, in the case of the cultural anthropology, there's at least an argument to be made that all these different theories of procreation that we see across societies are explicit, verbally transmitted, sort of culturally transmitted knowledge in the same way that school book language, school book grammar is culturally transmitted knowledge, but there is underlying that a whole level of implicit knowledge where people have intuitions about what's grammatical and what's not, but they can't really explain these very well, but you can show that they're following grammatical rules. And there may be, I'll be making the case that there may be something that you could call kinship core cognition that may go on in addition to, not to dismiss the importance of, but in addition to theories of procreation. That's an iceberg over there to illustrate this general point. So one tradition then, just which I will not be following up on too much here, looking at kinship and cognition. Here's another tradition, which I'll talk about briefly, but I'll be departing from to some extent. This is a ground squirrel here, and talking about the tradition of coming out of evolutionary theory, coming out of sociobiology, and moving into evolutionary psychology, a tradition of looking at kinship and cognition as being connected with kin recognition and recognizing genetic relatedness. So this will be familiar probably to most of the people here, maybe not to everybody, but you have the theory of kin selection and the theory of inclusive fitness, which says, for example, so the basic underlying evolutionary principle is you've got this ground squirrel here. It is doing something altruistic, which is, in this case, it's standing up and giving an alarm call in the presence of a hawk, presence of a coyote, some other predator. This is a dangerous thing to be doing. You're more likely to die standing up, bravely giving an alarm call, than you are just seeing the predator and slinking off to your burrow. On the other hand, there are going to be a lot of other ground squirrels around. They're going to share some of the genes that this individual carries, and this individual putting her life at risk is also reducing the risk to a lot of her relatives. Do the genetics, and if it turns out that the risk to her relative to the benefit to other individuals, and then you have to ask how many copies of these genes are shared by other individuals. When you go ahead and do the math, it can be adaptive to do this kind of altruistic thing. So you've got the theory of kin selection, and it suggests that you should modulate altruism toward other individuals, partly as a function of how closely related, what fraction of genes they share. You can also add to that your willingness to mate with other individuals, the coefficient of relatedness governing kin selection, closely related to another quantity, the coefficient of inbreeding, which would govern whether you mate or not with individuals. There are costs to inbreeding. So you might expect then that natural selection would build into organisms, perhaps including human beings, would build into organism some kind of machinery for bringing together a whole bunch of different information from different sources, boiling it all down, and popping up with a number, or at least something, a scale, a quantity on a meter that would be a measure of how closely related to this is this individual to me, and then I would regulate my behavior according to whether the scale says really closely related or not very closely related at all, or somewhere in the middle. So there's an argument to be made then, and it has been made in evolutionary psychology, that we ought to be looking for mechanisms of kin recognition and various inputs to that machinery. The output is some sort of scale or number. However, I think human kinship, I'm not disputing that there may very well be something somewhere in our brain which delivers a reading for how closely related is this individual. However, I think that human behavior toward kin is more complicated than just reading off a meter and getting the R value, the coefficient of relatedness there. There are several things, I think, that make the psychology of kinship more complicated than this. Two things in particular. One, I think that the adaptive problem that individuals are facing in dealing with their kin, in the human case, is going to be more complicated than just knowing the R value between myself and another individual or between different individuals out there. The problem that human beings face, and that anthropologists have documented at great length, is not simply knowing how closely related other individuals are. It is also developing social conventions based on kinship. And asking how social conventions develop and asking what is the evolution of, what are the evolutionary forces acting on, not simply on whether I help this individual or not, but rather, do I participate with the rest of us in maintaining a set of social conventions regarding kinship? That's a more complicated phenomenon, and it's more complicated than just a simple version of Hamilton's rule would predict. Let me just give an example of, this is not the main topic of this talk, I'll rush it through it very quickly, but let me just give some examples to illustrate this point. Here is sort of about the simplest possible version of this argument one could present. This is a game in the game theory sense. This is a game that I call the Brothers Karamazov game. You've got three brothers here, Ivan, Alyosha, and Dmitri, named, of course, after the characters in the Brothers Karamazov. And Dmitri is kind of a hapless character, and he needs help. Sometimes he turns to Ivan for help, sometimes he turns to Alyosha for help, and they have the opportunity to help him or not. One way to do this is to assume that Ivan and Alyosha act independently of one another. So Dmitri says help and goes to Ivan for help. Ivan helps him. Dmitri asks for help, goes to Alyosha for help. Alyosha helps him. But the brothers don't coordinate their behavior. When you go ahead and make that assumption, then you just get the simple sort of version of Hamilton's rule, which says that, well, Ivan's deciding whether to help Dmitri. Dmitri has half of his genes, and then he helps based on whether the benefit to Dmitri is greater than twice the cost to Ivan. Alyosha makes the same calculation. However, if you then turn things around and introduce a gene in the population for, call that individual nepotism, but introduce a gene for conditional nepotism or socially enforced nepotism. Now, Ivan goes to Alyosha and says, you know, Alyosha, we've both been helping out Dmitri. I'll give Dmitri even more help, but I want you to agree to do the same thing. When you actually look at that, what you find is that a gene for this extra help can actually spread and can result in a higher level of assistance than you would get in the simple Hamilton's rule case. We go ahead and actually do all the calculations with gene frequency. It turns out that that gene has a hard time invading the population, but once it gets established, it can support a higher level of altruism than you expect, up to 40% higher than you'd expect in the individual case. And this is a case where just using Hamilton's rule, taking it off the genealogies, doesn't give you exactly the right answer. You have to sit down and do the genetics. The point is that you can be more altruistic even than a brother if you can introduce this social convention of helping kin. That's a simple version. Here's a paper that I did a while back for an N-person version where you have a whole bunch of people. They're kind of all related to one another. Some of them are really able to help others. Some of them are sort of weaker players, can't help others as much. And you develop a whole system based on reputation where I saw that you helped this person, and this person has a pretty good reputation, so that gives you a lot of reputation, so I'm more willing to help you. You didn't help this person so much, but frankly, she doesn't have a really good reputation, didn't deserve that much help, so it doesn't really cost you too much in terms of reputation. You do kind of an N-person game, and you can demonstrate that you can get substantially more assistance to weaker players, even people who aren't able to help others at all. You may still help those people simply because it will help your reputation with the rest of us. And this is consistent with what a lot of anthropologists have argued, that in the domain of kinship, there's this ethic of just you help your kin, Not necessarily because you like those individuals so much, but just because it's what, as a righteous, responsible, dutiful member of our group, that's the kind of thing you do. So this is a model of something noted by anthropologists. So, one, I think the question of how do people treat their kin, how do people mentally represent kinship, is more complicated than just give me a bunch of inputs and the output is a coefficient of relatedness. The adaptive problem is learning a bunch of social conventions associated with kinship, and the representation of kinship then is going to be more complicated than just these R values. Another thing going on too is that, well, an awful lot of evolutionary psychology assumes that the way to do evolutionary theory, the way to apply evolutionary theory, is to look for adaptations. You say, here's an adaptive problem, what kind of mechanism, what kind of machinery would solve that problem, and let's go look for a mechanism, a piece of machinery like that. When you think, however, not about evolutionary psychology, but about how people apply evolutionary theory in other domains, like, for example, comparative anatomy, this is a little odd, because it's absolutely true that in the case of comparative anatomy, let's pick a piece of anatomy, let's pick the human foot, it's absolutely true that in the case of comparative anatomy that people are asking questions about, well, you start off with an adaptive problem, which is producing a foot that's supposed to be at the end of the leg. You're supposed to do walking on that foot. You're supposed to do running on that foot. And various features of the foot are adapted for walking and for running. So posing the adaptive problem, asking how the foot solves that problem, helps you to understand something about the human foot. However, if all you knew about human feet is that they're pretty good at walking and running bipedally on the African savannas, what would you predict? Well, maybe you'd predict a foot like this. Maybe you'd predict a hoof at the end of our feet. Maybe you'd predict a paw. If you really want to understand how human feet work, I mean, why they are the way they are, you want to look not only at adaptation, you also want to look at phylogeny. So you want to look at the fact that human feet are designed to do something very different from human hands, and they're operating rather differently from chimpanzee feet, but a lot of the features of the human foot, for example, the fact that the lever in the foot is the big toe rather than the middle toe, let's say, a lot of those features are homologous rather than necessarily adaptations. So I'll be coming back to this point about doing evolutionary psychology, but with some appreciation for homology, for phylogeny in there. But let me move on more specifically to the proposal I'll be developing here. I'm going to be talking about sort of presenting a more positive proposal about what's involved in thinking about kinship. And here's a slide that's kind of illustrating the argument I'm going to be making here. I'm going to be arguing here, presenting a case that there are really kind of three, well, there may very well be more than three, but there are at least three domains, cognitive domains of thinking about causation. And the first two domains here are going to be relatively familiar to people who know the literature in cognitive psychology and so on. I'll spend a little bit of time going over these. Some people may know this stuff here, some people may not. But there is evidence from various sources that people have specializations for thinking about, on the one hand, objects in space interacting with one another and mechanical causation involving those objects. Also, a domain of thinking that's concerned with agents, and agents having motives and purposes and plans and interacting with one another to achieve their goals or fail to achieve their goals, etc. And I'll be talking about those briefly, but then introducing the proposal that there is another domain of causal thinking that's associated with descent or progeneration. I and my coworker in psychology, Traft and Drew, call this descent tracking. There's also the cognitive scientist Mark Turner has talked about a psychology of progeneration. So I'll be covering this general topic and then moving on more specifically to descent and progeneration as I move along. So just talking in general about some of these first two domains before that are relatively more established within psychology, linguistics before moving on. The evidence for these domains, it comes partly from cognitive and developmental psychology, from the study of what's sometimes called core cognition. And then it also comes partly from linguistics, and especially from semantics, and especially the study of what's sometimes called conceptual structure. And these are two alternative sources of evidence. Fortunately, they provide converging evidence for sort of specialized systems. So let me start with this idea of core cognition, and particularly some of the evidence from experimental psychology regarding core cognition. So people interested in core cognition, the place to really turn would be Susan Carey's book, The Origin of Concepts, which lays out an awful lot of the stuff I'll be talking about here. People interested in this stuff, the evidence from linguistics, particularly recommend Steven Pinker's book, The Stuff of Thought, which some of the stuff I'll be talking about here will be covered by this. So talk about core cognition first. The proposal in theories of core cognition is that, we can talk about one type of concept that's directly tied to perception and sensory experience. So you get concepts like red and scratchy and loud and sour and so on. And then there are concepts that are tied to particular cultures and kind of explicitly presented to people. Things like kayak, fraction, exponent, gene, cross-cousin. Those are all culture-specific concepts. Now, there is a long-standing tradition in philosophy, that's the tradition of empiricism, that says these first two kinds of concepts are the only concepts there are. That you start off with a baby with a perceptual system. It is perceiving things like red and loud and so on. It's learning, associative learning is telling it that certain stimuli tend to go together. And eventually, you're building up these sort of abstract categories out of perception, out of sensory, out of perceptual experience. So, as John Locke said, there is nothing in our thoughts that was not first in our senses. There is, however, another tradition, if you want to throw philosophers in there, it would probably go back to Kant, or maybe even further than that, which says that perception, going from perception to explicit theories is not enough. That you also have you come installed from the factory, as it were, with some software for abstract concepts, including concepts of object, of number, various kinds of spatial relationships, the concepts of animacy. You have a bunch of mental tools that are hungry for, looking for evidence that, oh, okay, got it, that's an object, and knowing that it's an object, I can make a lot of inferences about it. Or, oh, okay, I can count these things, and I can then start figuring out things based on numbering them, and so on. So, core concepts then are abstract. They're not directly tied to perception, but they're also not learned. So this is one approach there, and I'll talk about some of this, and we could talk about some of the evidence. For example, talking about the psychology of objects in space, of mechanical causation, evidence that this is a domain of cognition, a domain of thinking about causality. A lot of evidence that there's a sort of psychology built into us for what we expect a stereotypical, prototypical physical object to look like. For example, we pretty much automatically assume that in the case of A, that because there's this continuity here, when I take this barrier away, we expect that C is going to be what we see rather than B, although both of those are consistent with what we see up above. And a lot of these experiments, going back to studies of infants, we bring babies into the laboratory, and if something is weird and violates their expectations, they spend more time looking at it. So baby in the laboratory sees A, sees B, baby is going to stare. What just happened? That was weird. On the other hand, baby sees A, sees C. It's like, yeah, okay, show me something else. So evidence then, we expect objects to be continuous. We expect that things that move together to be part of one unified object rather than being two separate objects in a case like this. We expect that objects are not going to pass through one another. So the baby's going to be surprised. It sees this screen flapping up and down. A barrier is put in the way. The baby's going to be surprised if the barrier just ends up flopping through this object rather than being stopped or blocked by the object. More specifically, we'll come back because this is something we'll come back to when we talk about kinship and so on, and the psychology of kinship, but other studies about object recognition. This is a paradigm involving object tracking. So what we do is we bring you into the lab, you see a bunch of dots on the screen, we tell you that we're going to indicate some of those dots by having circles flash around them, and then you're supposed to keep track of those dots as we move along. And people can keep track of up to about 3 or 4 of these dots, not much more than that. But for example, if one of these dots moves behind a screen, you'll say, aha, well, it moved behind a barrier there, and it's still behind the barrier, but I kept track of that. One thing to note is that people, while they're tracking where the objects are pretty much turned off anything about what the objects are. So you can be watching these dots, and I tell you, did you notice that this dot changed colors and that it changed shape? And people will say, no, I didn't notice that. I just know that it went from here to here. So we seem to be tapping particularly into the where system in the brain in this kind of research. Again, we'll come back to this because some of the research I'll be talking about deals with this. This is research in so-called object files. Again, part of our machinery for keeping track of physical objects. So you're in the lab. I tell you, you're going to see 2 letters flash, and then shortly after that, a 3rd letter is going to flash. Hit one button if the 3rd letter is the same as one of the first 2. Hit a different button if it's different. So you come in here, you see A and B, or whatever the letters are, flashing. Then these shapes move around, and they sit here. And then, well, A flashes here, except that you take a little longer. So this is a measure of reaction time. What you see is this happens, and, well, A was supposed to be up here. I did see A before, but A was supposed to be up here. Wait, A is down here. Yeah, I did see A before. Okay, I'll press the yes button. On the other hand, if A had flashed up here, I would right away press A. So I'm keeping track of, I'm attaching a little file to these objects as they move around, and I expect those objects to hang on to their files, and it slows me down if somehow these qualities, these things are shifting around. So, tons more stuff we could cover, but that's some of the evidence on mechanical causation. Linguistics is also covering some of the same topics and coming to similar conclusions. So talking about linguistics, we should note that there's a distinction between, first, a broad distinction between what are called open class and closed class forms. So open class forms, as the name suggests, you can kind of add new examples to the class pretty easily. Most nouns, most verbs, most adjectives are open class. It's pretty easy to learn new ones, and there are relatively few restrictions on the kind of concepts that you can slap a noun on, slap a verb on, slap an adjective on. On the other hand, closed class forms are much more limited. They include things like singular versus plural markings, pronouns, verb tenses, prepositions, demonstratives like this and that. Those are things where it tends to be a relatively closed class. You don't readily add new things to those categories, and they typically take on a relatively restricted range of meanings. So not just any old concept typically will make it into the closed class forms. They are kind of a closed club, and they don't let just anybody join the club. So in particular, closed class forms typically have an affinity for things from core cognition. There's a sort of natural sort of affinity between those things. And so, for example, concretely, looking at prepositions, spatial prepositions in English, and different languages are different, but spatial prepositions in English tell us something about, they offer a window on our cognition about space, which actually fits nicely with the evidence from experimental psychology. So, for example, English prepositions register information about figure and ground relationships. They encode information about a limited range of distinctive features. They are digital rather than analog. So they don't tell us much more about the objects. So the preposition in the lamp is on the table, or the plane is on the runway, The on doesn't tell me anything about absolute sizes. It doesn't tell me whether the lamp is valuable or not, or what color the airplane is. The object tracking system doesn't really care about those things, and on, in, etc. seem to be tapping into our object tracking system, our system for understanding spatial relationships. If we need that extra information, we can just throw it in with our open class forms, but the closed class forms only care about a restricted range of information. That's one system. Briefly talk about, we've got a system as well for recognizing animacy. And relatively simple stimuli, if they're moving in the right way, can get us thinking that these are animated objects. We already gave you the example, Hyder and Simmel, showing how easy it is to start thinking of these things as animate. An even simpler example, classic experiments by Michaud. Michaud up above is showing squares on a screen. One square moves close, touches the other, and the other moves away. People perceive that as mechanical causation. One thing is hitting the other, causing it to move. All you have to do is have some little bit of separation there. The gray square approaches, the black square, the black square starts moving away without being touched, the black square continues to move away, and people start to interpret that as representing psychological states, psychological conditions. So the black square is trying to get away from the gray square. The black square is picking up its lunch tray and moving to another table. We're sort of putting a psychological interpretation on those things. Okay, let's move on then and develop this proposal that there is another domain of cognition associated with descent and progeneration. Start off summarizing some of the linguistic evidence, and I'll talk briefly about kin terminology. Move on to some of the experiments we've started. I've got a question mark here because in contrast to extensive psychological studies in the first two areas, not a lot going on here, but I'll talk about some of what we got going on. So some of the evidence that we have regarding kinship core cognition actually comes from the study of language, from this sort of green area in the table here. And I've done some work in this area. And kin terminology then, in particular, terms for kin, seem to be a window onto a domain of cognitive structure in the same way that various closed class forms can tell us something about the psychology of space. Terms for kin seem to be letting us into telling us something about the psychology of kinship and descent. So in particular, kin terms, and by this I include terms for affines, that is to say relatives by marriage, they act like closed class forms. Syntactically, they're just garden variety nouns, but they act like closed class forms. So they cover a bounded semantic domain, a relatively closed semantic domain. So we have, for example, covering the domain of kinship, we have words for father's sister, and we have words for daughter's daughter. We do not have words for best friend's husband, best friend's girlfriend, boss's daughter. Those might all be important relationships and important to know about, but they fall outside the domain of kinship, and they're sort of outside this kind of space. Kin terms are, well, they're kind of like spatial terms in the sense that they encode figure-ground relationships within a kinship space. So between a kin type or figure and then a central ego or ground. And again, they encode only a limited amount of information about the focal kin type. So I tell you aunt, you can tell what sex that person is, but you don't know her absolute age. In some cultures you'll know her relative age, but not absolute age. You don't know whether she's a rich or poor aunt. You don't know whether she's nice or nasty. Those are all important things to know, but within the domain of kinship cognition proper, seems like you're not encoding that kind of information there. The formal analysis of kin terms is a sort of whole world unto itself. I've done some work in the area. Here are some papers I've done here. We've got other people who've done this. I'm willing to get into some of the technical nitty-gritty here if anybody wants, but there's I'll sort of just skim through what seem to be some of the major findings rather than go through quite so much of the details. But just mention that something about the organization of kin terms. Kin terms commonly organized around a limited number of distinctive features. For example, in English, the distinction between lineal and collateral relatives, relatives on sort of ascending, descending line of descent versus relatives off to the side, is quite important. So we do not lump together cousins with brothers and sisters in English. On the other hand, lineal versus collateral, well, that doesn't prevent you from lumping together male cousin and female cousin, so English speakers have no problem with lumping together cousin and cousine. So the lineal collateral distinction is particularly important in English. Other distinctions are less significant. For example, you get down to the sex distinction. Most English kin terms are marked for sex. However, you get to a more distant relationship like cousin, and that's less significant. So you can actually rank some of these distinctions. Not only can you say, is this distinction operating, but you can say this distinction is relatively high ranking in English, this is relatively low ranking. You could look at the Trobriand Islanders and you'd find, well, a new distinction here, but some of the same distinctions, but in a different ranking. For example, Trobrianders, it's very important to keep matrilines separate. So equating father-sister with mother is something you're not going to want to do. They're different matrilines. On the other hand, turning a father-sister into a father's mother, well, they belong to father's matriline. That's okay. Lump them together. That's not a problem. That is messing up with generations, but keeping generations separate is not as important as keeping matrilines separate in this system. And in fact, you can generate a lot of the variation we see in different kinship systems simply by taking a modest set of distinctive features and just ranking some high, ranking some low, and having them interact with different kin terms. In fact, a lot of the sort of mechanics of how this works is fairly similar to what linguists have come up with in the case of spatial prepositions. So, for example, in English spatial prepositions, when we talk about a cup on the table, the table is both supporting the cup. In addition, the cup is above the table, so support and superior. On the other hand, in English, support is more important than being superior, so the picture on the wall is supported by the wall. We can still use that word on, even though the picture is no longer superior to or above the wall. By contrast, in Japan, they're postpositions because they come afterwards, but same idea. In Japan, by contrast, it's more important that the thing be above. So in Japan, ue refers both to the cup on the table. It also refers to the lamp hanging down above the table. Those are both ue. On the other hand, you do something different for the picture on the wall. So again, you have a limited number of distinctive features. Different languages are going to rank those differently and give you different sort of scope for different extensions of different prepositions. In fact, there's a lot of similarity between the conceptual structure, a lot of overlap or connection between the conceptual structure of kinship, the core cognition of kinship and core cognition of space. Here's a proposal for how kinship space and physical space are related to one another, sort of systematic correspondences between these things. A lot of stuff here, and I don't want to go through all this, but the proposal then for how these sort of how the language, particularly spatial prepositions of physical space, and then the language of kinship, particularly kin terms, are related to one another. So in fact, I mean, here's where all that stuff about feet and paws and hooves comes into the picture. This is a proposal that various people coming from various disciplines have made, that a lot of human abstract cognition is actually derived from our machinery for thinking about space. So we've got machinery for handling spatial concepts, and that's probably a very general mammalian thing, but then this machinery is then copied, duplicated, specialized for handling things like, well, thinking about time, which people commonly think of in spatial terms. We talk about something being ahead of us. We talk about moving a meeting from Tuesday to Wednesday, and so on. We use the language of space for thinking about time. The language of possession. We think of somebody having something. Well, we talk about property going to somebody or somebody keeping certain property. We use the language of space and movement for thinking about this abstract relationship of possession. And people have now, linguists have been onto this for a long time, suggesting that space is this primary domain, and then this is secondarily exapted to thinking about more abstract domains. Linguists, some psychologists have been onto this for a while. We now get people doing neurology, kind of getting into the act. So for example, here's a general review article arguing about how we've repurposed spatial perception to thinking about social cognition. Here's some actual brain research. I'm not a brain person, so you'll forgive me if I rush through this, but some actual brain research where first we've got one task where you're asked to assess which of these objects is closer, and then you've got another task where you're asked just would you have positive or negative feelings. And of course in language we commonly talk about being close to somebody, being distant from somebody. And in fact you find that a lot of the same brain areas are activated in both cases. By contrast, when you give a different task, which is just recognizing is A the same as B, you don't find, whether it's faces or physical objects, you don't find the activation of these sort of spatial regions there. So contrary to, for example, a proposal by Marshall Solins that the heart of kinship is, well, he uses the expression mutuality of being. To be kin to somebody is in some sense the two of you to be identical or the two of you to be the same. By contrast, it looks like the psychology of kinship is not A equals B. The psychology of kinship is A and B are in a certain relationship to one another in kinship space. So the space representation of kinship seems to owe something to, seem to borrow something from the psychology of space. Nonetheless, kinship is going to be a specialized domain in its own right, and although I'm courting controversy here to say this, it is likely to be the case that particularly genealogical connections are of particular importance in thinking about kinship. Let me be careful about this. We're not saying that every time you use a kin term, every time you say that people are in such and such a relationship, they necessarily have the genealogical relation implied by that relationship. What we can say, however, is that when we look, again, sticking with the language of kinship, when we look at kin terms as a system, and in English, for example, ask you, what do you call a father's father? What do you call a father's brother? Well, what do you call that person's son, etc.? When you follow this through, what you find is that, and I picked this pretty much at random off the web because there are many, many examples. This is from the EBO. What you find is that these particular kin terms can be placed on a genealogical diagram. So whether or not a kin term is used consistently most of the time to refer to genealogical relationships, what we can say is that the kinship space is genealogically structured in the sense that you can map the terminology in one society onto a genealogical diagram. And that is a major, important empirical finding. You don't find necessarily that the kin terms in a society map onto the periodic table or a table of ranks or onto just general non-kin social networks, but you do find that they map onto a genealogical tree. And that is a major, important empirical finding, social sciences. So far, what I've been doing, what I've been talking about is, in talking about, go there. So far, what I've been doing in talking about kinship is introduce this idea that there are different domains of conceptualization, the different domains of thinking about causation. I've made a bit of a case with the evidence from language that there might actually be a domain of core cognition for thinking about kinship. I haven't covered it much, and probably time doesn't permit. Another area of study, the cognitive scientist Mark Turner has looked at kinship metaphors. His book, Death is the Mother of Beauty, is a treatment of this topic. And you can project the psychology of kinship, representations of kinship, onto some kinds of metaphors, and you can't project them onto others. So, vice is the child of poverty. That makes sense. That's a good metaphor. On the other hand, decapitation is the mother of death. That doesn't quite work, because it's not, you don't have one thing continuously existing through time, another thing continuously existing through time, and one causing the other. That sort of mapping between the psychology of, well, progeneration is Turner's term. That kind of mapping doesn't work in the case of, I mean, it's a causation, but it's not really a progenerative kind of causation. So people are extending kin terms very widely to understand causation, but not infinitely widely. And this is another line of evidence regarding the psychology of kinship. Well, there's not that much in the way of, following out this. You have this proposal that there's core cognition for kinship. We have some evidence for this from linguistics, and looks like the linguistics can tell us some kind of interesting things about what the core psychology of kinship looks like. Just barely getting into, though, this whole topic of, just barely getting into this whole topic, though, of, well, do we have the kind of evidence that we have for other domains of causation that there might be a core psychology of kinship? And that is something that I'm investigating now. And in fact, it's just this week that we're going to start running the test versions of this and making sure that our research instruments are going to behave themselves. So the idea is, can we take elementary, simple perceptual processes of the right kind and get people to attribute ideas of kinship to those? So let me then see if this will take a sec to sort of get this set up and get this running. And you're going to see first something that's going to be familiar, and then you'll see a variation on it. I think for safety's sake, I'm not going to try and expand the screen because, or fill the screen, because I'm not sure how well that'll work, but we'll do this. So this is something we're going to be running on this Mechanical Turk, which allows you to recruit a whole bunch of subjects. Anybody who's got a computer gets paid a little bit to do this. So we introduce the experiment. We tell people, they can quit when they want, and so on. And then we get people moving along. If I can make this work. Oh, here I have to accept. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm male. I'm 90 years old. Okay. And so first we have a version. People are going to watch this, and then they get a box to type in a response. Okay. And this is more or less what you've seen, a little better animation. I can't really speed this up, so you just have to bear with it. Yeah, thanks. Probably helps. Okay, we won't be showing both these. Let's see. Let me go on. Okay. Then you do your description here. We won't be showing both of these to the same individual. Some individuals will see the thing you just saw. Some will see this, which is nearly identical, but not quite the same. So some people doing this will see this. Okay. Other than that, it's pretty much the same. So we're introducing this event at the beginning where just one object coming out of the other, and then we run through this whole hider and symbol thing. So the first thing is, do we get what kind of difference? Do we get any difference in response when we analyze the text that people produce? Okay, and here is, I'll have to make sure my finger's in the right position. Here's kind of the next thing. And so here's the next part of the experiment, and I'm not sure if this is going to give me, we already talked about object files and the idea that when something moves around, you assume it drags its file with it. So if I saw the letter A here, then I assume as it moves around, it continues to have the letter A. So I'm going to have to position my fingers by 0 and 1. And we may actually work in a demonstration of how this works rather than just the verbal description, but do this. Okay. Oh, did it wrong. Anyway, we do that for a while. So what we're doing now is we've already described this sort of object file format and the fact that people expect to see an object dragging its file around as it moves through space. So you don't just assume that the letter sticks where it was there. You assume that the object drags it around. The question we're asking is, are object files inherited? So if you have one little blob generating another blob, do we expect that the generated blob, the offspring as it were, is going to carry the parent's object file? So once we've got that, if we get results there, then we can do various variations. For example, if two objects are close to one another, but you don't actually have one generating the other, are you going to have the same effect with object files being dragged along? Does it make a difference? How much is this specifically tied to what you might call biological or biomorphic stimuli? So the things we've been showing you are these kind of blobby amoeba-like things. Does that make a difference? Or is it just anything that's the source? Will sort of more mechanical sort of triangles and squares have the same kind of effect? Does inheritance cover more than one generation? So blob number 1 generates blob number 2, generates blob number 3. Do people keep track of descent through multiple lines? So a variety of things we're going to be, as we get this up and running, a variety of things we'll be looking at. There's a book and an expression from the anthropologist Maurice Bloch, who's spent a lot of time thinking about anthropology, and unusually for a cultural anthropologist, really trying to integrate what goes on in cultural anthropology with some of what goes on in cognitive psychology. Maurice Bloch has the expression in and out of each other's bodies. And Bloch, contrary to some anthropologists like David Schneider, other folks like Janet Karsten, who argue that kinship per se is this fuzzy, ill-defined domain, Bloch is arguing that, in fact, going out of, coming into one another's bodies is psychologically extremely salient, and it's the sort of thing that really sticks in our heads and that we pay attention to. Bring an organism into the world with a psychology of paying attention to what comes out of bodies, what organisms coming out of bodies, organisms sexually entering into one another's bodies, and an organism that really is tuned into that kind of stuff. Stick them in an environment where you actually have, well, not blobs, but human beings, sometimes coming out of other human beings' bodies. And this is going to be the kind of thing that really is going to stick in people's heads and that people register and that people say, oh, better put an entry up in kinship space for that one. So that's the sort of proposal that we're exploring here, that relatively simple perceptual stimuli may be not absolutely necessary, but may be strongly prototypical or default assumption that is important in governing, regulating ideas about kinship. If this is the case, then we would have some explanation for why we have this domain of kinship that seems to pop up over and over again across societies. At the same time, we also have room here for something like individual cultures elaborating their own particular ideas about the nature of procreation and going off in their own particular directions as well. That doesn't exclude that possibility. There is core cognition, and then there is more culturally specific peripheral cognition. That's the proposal. So that's the general proposal, the idea that we're working on. A lot of talk so far, a few pretty pictures. We hope to be generating data fairly soon to see if any of this kind of stuff works out. So we're doing this first sort of on MTurk among American adults, and then if we start getting something interesting, taking it developmentally, taking it to kids, and then moving across cultures. Who knows? Maybe we'll find out on the island of Yap that nobody gives a damn about one blob coming out of another because it just doesn't register. But anyway, thanks. And that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I have a sort of theory issue, or maybe clarification, or
sure.
But then after that, I have a bit of very concrete feedback about the study.
Yeah, let me actually get a feedback and suggestions on sort of running experiments are very welcome. So I rewrite things down.
Right, well, as I was just saying, my colleagues and I have done a fair amount of online research.
Okay.
So that gives any added.
Yeah.
But the theory point is, your issues, or the point you made with regards to not just sort of black boxing the mechanisms of adaptation in evolutionary psychology, but appreciating phylogenetic constraints, the legacy of history, and specifically the role of homology or different kinds of phylogy.
Right.
Very well taken. There's a lot of people here. I wish that Mark Barrett was here.
Okay.
I don't know if you caught his PNAS paper a few years ago, but if you're interested in these things, I'd highly recommend it. It's a very deep dive into, but an accessible one, into how various forms of homology might play out both over development and also over the evolution of the species. And during the
Great. Yeah, I know Clark, and I missed that paper.
That's a great paper. In your earlier remarks, you seem to be juxtaposing claims of adaptation with the insights of coming from perspectives like homology. And whereas I don't know if you really meant to do that, because it's not as if adaptation doesn't apply, in the case of a homologous structure.
Well, sure. I mean, but there are going to be different. I mean, there are going to be aspects of the human foot, like the fact that, our toes are relatively short compared to Lucy's toes, and that seems to have to do with bipedalism and running specifically. Running works better with shorter toes. So that's adaptation.
Right.
On the other hand, it's not clear that there's any mechanical reason why you'd want to pick toe number 1 rather than toe number 3 as the main lever. The horses long ago decided on toe number 3, and well, if you start with a chimpanzee, it's clear why you'd want to do that, or something like that.
No, I completely on the same page with regards to appreciating both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
But then when you looked at the example from the Parkinson and Wheatley neuroscience paper, it's really cool work on how social distance seems to recycle mechanisms.
They're doing a general summary of that, and then the Yamaguchi or wherever it was the specific. They were actually presenting the neurology.
Right, but even there, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, I think you use the term excitation. I think that's an empirical question and an assumption, the extent to which we have, there's, programming for that form of recycling to help humans navigate the interaction with other people. So this is kind of quibbling a little bit about overemphasizing necessarily development
Okay.
by itself. Okay, so then the other thing is that hopefully will be useful is, I don't know if other people felt this way, but I thought that the difference between the conditions was really hard to see.
Okay.
It was very fast.
On the Hyder and Simmel?
Yeah, and when your online research is inherently noisy,
Yeah.
and so I don't think it would be a less rigorous way to do the study.
Yeah.
To go ahead and make it much, much, much slower and clearer. You know, the progression out of the box or not.
Great.
And I would also say, so
I
this is kind
will,
of
we've got a code guy, and I will go. He will tear out his hair, and I will say too bad.
well, tell him for me if he has any hair at all, he should be happy. But,
Okay.
and then also, you start with the most obvious, strong way to do this experiment, and then
Yeah.
that
We want to get the
Yeah.
first get the effect, and then start asking what do we chip away.
So if it were me, I would make the little figure kind of like struggle to get out of the box. I mean, don't just have it zip right out, but if you're trying to really simulate something akin to the psychology about recognizing parturition,
Okay.
let's make it work for it a little bit. That would be my suggestion. But at minimum, really want to slow it down, so because people are going to miss it. They're guaranteed.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. I am. As I say, we're now in the test. Sort of refining it stage. So any suggestions that people have on that are very welcome. So you guys, thanks for being guinea pigs as well.
What do you think of Susan Carey and Buddy Thompson's idea that relational cognition is part of core cognition?
That's fine, and I don't have a problem with that. But you still want to know what's special about kinship within that domain. So here's I'll offer one suggestion. This is this thing that ran fast, died too fast for anybody to see it. Navigating through physical space, there are various distinctions that are going to be important, like supported versus hanging loose, or above versus below. So one distinction that's going to be very important is the distinction between movable and immovable. So, for example, if I'm giving you directions, telling you, go until you see the elm tree, or go to where the baobab tree grows by the river, that's a useful set of directions. Telling you, go to where you see a white SUV, or going to where you see the mother elephant and the daughter, that's not a very useful set of directions. So you're going to want to store information about landmarks differently from information about stuff you can pick up and move around. So in physical space, that's an important distinction. And for example, we find, there's a whole literature on this, but anybody who knows Portuguese or Spanish will know the difference between ser and estar, one of which is a permanent condition, one of which is a temporary condition. So ser is what, if I say ser and sick, or versus estar, sick, doente, or whatever in Spanish, one of those means that you're an invalid, permanently, part of your permanent condition. The other means you're just sick now and you'll get well. So there's a distinction between, in the physical domain, between movable and immovable, probably corresponding, again, relational psychology, probably corresponding to a distinction. In fact, didn't go into it, but there's kinship, linguistically, falls within the broader domain of possession. So relatives are things you have. So you use possessive forms to talk about kin. So in English, Jane, possessive brother, father, possessive the bride, has, possessive noun, and aunt. You use possessive constructions for talking about kinship. Well, in many, many languages, there is a distinction between different grades of possession, and there's often a distinction between alienable and inalienable possession. And inalienable possession, intrinsic possession, is a sort of more basic sort of cognitively central kind of possession than alienable possession. And across languages, the two central core kinds of intrinsic, inalienable possession are body parts and kin. So those are the things, if there is a difference in the language between those, almost certainly one or the other or both of those will be, body parts, kin, will be things you intrinsically possess. We talked about Trobriand island kinship, interesting distinction there. They use a inalienable possession, possessive, referring to kin, except that they use the alienable possessive to refer to a spouse, husband or wife, because your sister's always your sister, spouses, well, that's maybe another story. And ascending generation relatives are more intrinsic than descending generation. Everybody here has a father and mother. Probably not everybody here has a child. It's more intrinsic to who you are. So if there's a broader relational psychology, within the domain of relational psychology, there is a psychology of social landmarks who are stuck in place, and that's certainly kin, maybe a few other things like ethnicity and so on, and then things that you can pick up and move around, and so on. So that's a long answer to the question, but I hope it gets some.
So, just a very quick follow-up. Do you think that kinship, if there is such a thing, if relational cognition is part of core cognition,
Yeah.
I think you just said that if so, then kinship cognition would be a part of, or a specialized form of relational cognition. Does that mean that it would build on the basic, the basic forms of relational cognition? That kinship would be built out of more basic forms of relationship?
My suspicion is no. My suspicion is kinship is something in its own self. Maybe accept. Can I say accept? Maybe borrowing from spatial cognition, but not that there's some more fundamental kind of social unit. But kinship is it's fairly basic. At least I would suggest that. But that's I could be wrong. That's just the way I tend to think of it.
So I want to endorse Colin's theoretical suggestion, and your hesitation just now, motivates that further, which is, given how central kinship is to all of human societies, and the plausible conjecture that there's deep antiquity there, there's every reason to think that there is co-optation rather than exaptation. That is, that the reuse of that spatial neural architecture for genealogical reasoning has been selected for. It's
It is. I'm certainly not suggesting it just happened purely. It's not like your nose holds up your glasses. Your nose is not selected to hold up your glasses.
No, but it could be.
But it's more.
It could be something like we can read because the technology of reading and writing exploits features of our object recognition system, right? And so it is a pure exaptation in the sense that there has been no selection on the psychology for that capability, but we use an ancestral trait entirely for a novel purpose. And okay, so it sounds like we're on the same page. Maybe it's just a terminological difference.
I mean, it could be wrong. It could be that the kinship stuff isn't shaped by natural selection. It really is just a metaphor or something. But I'm inclined to the stronger view that you take this thing, make a copy, and then you select on it and get it really specialized for
Okay. So
that's my inclination. And I'm thinking that this is likely to go way back before humans. That some version of this is going to be present in other animals.
yeah. So we would I think maybe more precisely want to call that co-optation rather than exaptation. But in terms of the methodological details, I also endorse Colin's point. I should point out that when he came to UCLA a number of years ago, he had lots of hair. So that has all been lost in good cause, and he's absolutely right that it should be much clearer. I would say that proportionally the objects or agents, whatever you want to call them, in the frame need to be much bigger, and they need to move more slowly. So the original Hyder and Simmel, if you look at the size of the objects relative to the size of the frame, the objects are much larger than yours are. And I think that's important, it's especially because people participate in online studies on phones and tablets and things like that, right? Second, if I'm going to be a skeptic, so I'm a reviewer when you submit the paper, right? I say, well, there's an important comparison condition that you set up the whole argument with regard to different types of core cognition and with regard
Right,
to height
okay.
and symbol, but then you didn't carry out, and that's the mechanical comparison. So if you have an object that has some property, right,
Right, okay.
and it splits, right,
Okay.
then I expect both of the resulting fragments to have the same property, and that is not the psychology of descent,
yeah.
right? That's just
Okay.
the psychology of mechanical integrity.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, that's good, and you know, we want to vary conditions, in fact, we want to see, is there a difference between one blob, and we can try and sharpen this, really like generating another blob, a tiny little blob out of it that you know, comes out and then gets bigger, versus, I mean, do you have the same effect just taking, you know, splitting something in half?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that would be one condition to test. And so a real question is, to what extent, if we get an effect, to what extent is this really seem to be specific to some sort of biological thing, or to what extent is it just a psychology of source and thing coming out of that source?
And one anecdotal observation supporting very different kinds of cognition for those two domains is that, and perhaps you've had this experience also, when teaching undergraduates, if we use terms like daughter cells,
Yeah.
right, they have a hard time getting their head around it because they understand descent, but there's no mother anymore,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
If
right,
the
right,
mother
sure.
has divided and there are
Sure.
two daughters, what happened to the mother, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And yet, you know, that is what would happen if we took the metaphor a chip off
Right.
the old block literally, right?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so that's good, and that we've talked about with my collaborator about variations, and so we do have to, you know, we may end up with a paper where we say we can't determine yet whether this is really truly, you know, core cognition of kinship or just some sort of something about substance or something. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. And we also want to know why isn't that horrible scene everybody remembers from Aliens? Why does that, you know, why is that not a case of disinteracting? Or alien, singular.
The people who study kinship terminology, as you know, came up with a very interesting taxonomy suggesting that the kinship systems don't vary in a random way, but there are a limited subset, a limited number of subsets of, you know, there's Crow and Omaha and Eskimo and so forth. And I wonder if you think that, if you're interested in since you're interested in the language aspects of this, kinship terminology is not the same as kinship behavior or cognition.
Oh, yeah.
But if you think that kinship terminology reflects sort of core cognition in the sense that it's a form of language, and then could you potentially, or would you like to be able to, and how would you derive the basic forms of kinship terminology from from core cognition in some way?
Yeah, that's good. I'll give you the short answer.
Would you
which
do a
is,
complementarial analysis?
I'll give you the short answer, which is here's a bunch of papers, and yeah, I think you can derive sort of major categories by you know varying the ranking of different constraints. Where was I? For example, if with Trowbridge and kin terms, if you start to flip things around and say it's more important to keep generations separate than it is to keep matrilineals separate, so you're doing both things, but you flip the priority around, then you get a different, you switch from this is a Crow system here for the Trowbridges, you switch to something different. So that would be the you can, and I've done you know, worked out some of the details for some of that stuff. So, yeah.
I think part of the question here in terms of the numbers of terminologies goes back to some fundamental questions about terminologies and kin terms.
Yeah.
And also kin relations as whether, for example, is a terminology in some way a way of categorizing a domain that already exists. For example, if you think of the genealogical domain as something that's already there in the sense of people have a notion of tracing down through parent and child relations. We have a genealogical space as a consequence of that. So one view is that, well, terminologies are a categorization of that. And then one asks about, well, on what basis is that categorization taking place? And of course, that would lead to one answer about how much variability could one have. It would have to do with what are the constraints in that kind of categorization process. But another approach, which is that's looking at it from the wrong direction. That is, doesn't account for the fact that terminologies are highly organized structural systems that don't, with a generative logic to them, where one can literally say, here are the core concepts of this terminology. From this, we can then generate the entire terminology. And from that, we can predict what are those mappings onto the genealogical space. Of course, in that the second scenario I'm mentioning, then of course the question of variability comes down to, well, what are the possibilities? What are the sort of the generative things from which you can build a terminology? What are the constraints on that generative process? And that would give us sort of a handle on the question of where does the variability come in? And I think, in a way, it comes to, I think, it is sort of an analogy between what's going on in the kinship domain on the one side, and this will come back to what you're saying about the psychology of kinship, and let's say the area of arithmetic and numbers and counting on the other side. Because in the area of quantity, on the one hand, we understand that in terms of counting systems and arithmetic and natural numbers, this is not just an elaboration of the what maybe they are psychologically in terms of quantity estimation is one way of dealing with quantity. This is bigger than that, therefore it ought to have more things. And subitizing, which we know works up to about 3 or 4, but rather there seems to be a conceptual framework that's built on top of that, that may be built coming from it, but it's built on top of that, that makes sort of a real jump in terms of what one is doing. It's not just an elaboration on it. And it's possible that a similar thing is going on in the kinship area as well. That is, what you're referring to, the psychology of kinship, we think of it as sort of being analogous to the notion of subitizing and quantity estimation as core psychological aspects. There may be something like that in the kinship area as well, but that when we talk about terminologies, it's like arithmetic, which is you're coming up with something completely different that's built on that, but that it is taking it to a whole different plane by virtue of the fact it's not just extending it, but rather doing something completely different on top of that, which is sort of a long way of saying whether it makes sense to think of what you're talking about in terms of the psychology of kinship being sort of like trying to get at somewhat in the area of numbers, that is the same thing of, well, are we looking for something sort of like subitizing and quantity estimation, that is something at that level that's part of the psychology, which itself doesn't tell us what gets produced with kinship, in the same way knowing about subitizing and quantity estimation doesn't tell us about arithmetic, but rather there is that underlying, it could be there is that underlying psychology that is there, from which one's making that same kind of leap forward as well. Is that?
Yeah, no, those are good questions, and just briefly addressing the later part of what you're saying, and then going back to the earlier part. Yeah, so in the case of arithmetic, I mean the foundations for on the one hand there are psychological foundations to our number sense, knowing the number of objects in an array up to about 3 or 4. And then knowing approximate numbers of things much larger, and those are very general faculties that birds do it, bees do it, etc. Found in many species. And then there is this cultural, and some cultures don't do it, but there's this cultural practice of counting. And if you look at counting systems as they've developed in a lot of different cultures, you're going to find that there are all these similarities between counting systems, not because counting itself is something that's built into us, but just because that's how you would do counting. So possibly something like that going on in the case of kinship. And specifically, I think, so this psychology of progeneration or descent may be there as a kind of human faculty. Elaborating that into kinship systems, I think there's another thing going on, which is there is a logic of communication and of sort of conveying information and being able to understand that we are sort of on the same page. And you have to think about that too, principles of kind of optimal communication, and those apply not just to kinship, not just to prepositions, they apply to things that have no meaning whatsoever, like phonology and so on. But there's this general sort of, so in addition to psychology of kinship, there is a psychology of communication, and giving as much relevant information to you as I can is one imperative, and making as little effort as possible is the other imperative, and it's trade-offs between those things. And that's going to be a general principle of communication. It's going to extend very broadly. So it's not just, with kin terminology, yeah, it's not just the psychology of kinship. You can use that as a window on the psychology of kinship, but to actually do the terminology, you're also going to want to add how does communication work, and how would this you want to, why is it that I would understand this unusual use of kin terms that you're doing in terms of some general principles of sort of how interpretation works. And it's, who's the name, Regier, how does anybody pronounce that? Did some stuff like using sort of communication theoretic stuff to understand kin terminology, paper in Science magazine. So yeah, there's things specific to language that are going on in the case of kin terminology that aren't simply, you're not simply taking them out of the psychology of kinship, even if the kinship gives you a window. And the other thing is, I take your point. I said that kin terms map onto genealogy. However, it does not follow that you could simply take a genealogy, make up any set of principles you want for classifying things in that genealogy, and come up with a realistic kinship system. I could take a tree like this, and yeah, it's true that you can take Igbo kin terminology and map it onto this tree. However, I could take this tree and make up some silly system for how I classify different individuals on this tree, and it would be logically consistent. It just wouldn't be something that human beings would come up with. So I could, well, very common in a lot of cultures to have cross-sibling categorization. So a term, what a man calls his brother is different from what a woman calls her brother. So there's a sex of speaker distinction. That's not, it's, I don't know, what 10, 15, 20% of languages do that. What is very rare, I don't know if it exists at all, it's logically very simple, but it would be simply a sex of speaker distinction where you ignore the sex of the relative. So instead of a different word for same-sex sibling versus opposite-sex sibling, just imagine a word for man-sibling versus woman-sibling. I mean, that makes perfectly good sense. I mean, there's a word, I use one word for my siblings, my sister uses a different word for her siblings. We don't distinguish sex of sibling. So in that case, you're not looking at whether they're opposite sex or same sex, you're just asking sex of ego. That, maybe somebody does that somewhere, but it's logically simple, but people aren't doing that because, I mean, you could get that off of genealogy, but there's more to the psychology of kinship than simply, here's a genealogy, make up a set of rules for classifying kids. So there's something more to the psychology of kinship than just pulling it off the genealogy. So that's getting back to the first point.
We were out of time.